How are you doing? My name is Pat McGarth. I'm the former editor of the Daily Journal. And this morning I'm joined by Una Mullally, who's a broadcaster and a well-known columnist with the Irish Times. He's from Moore, who I've never met before, but it sounds very much like she's from there with an accent like that. She is a political correspondent with the Irish Examiner and a former colleague of mine, Freya McClemens, who's a northern correspondent for the Irish Times. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Hiya.
How are you all? Yeah, right. Here's the discussion point. The whole thing about a United Ireland, it's now, the discussion is well underway. But one of the things is there's a perception that the people of the South do not really either A, understand the North, or B, are sort of frightened by it. And in the wake of John Hume's recent sad passing, one of the things that came to the fore was the courage of Hume. And particularly the Sunday Independent. It was not just the Sunday Independent. The Irish Times came up there in RT. And last Sunday there was a 7-page an apology that was not an apology sort of thing about the coverage about him. So that, like, I'll give you an example. So this is just to sort of frame it a bit. On August 8th, 1993, Eamon Dunphy wrote on the Sunday Independent, Mr. John Hume, being the principal international enforcer, licensed to speak on to the world on our behalf, the political bomber flying over the Union sets, trying to kill them. Now, that is that to everyone? Is that the sort of level of perception that John Hume, Northerners, and all the rest were? Una, seeing that you're the one with the, I presume, not too many connections to the North, what is your opinion?
What's my opinion on how the media perception of the North?
How the media in the South, how the media in the South has portrayed the North.
I think they're. Okay, first of all, I think that you're right. You're right when you say the kind of the A or the B, the people are either don't understand or are afraid. I actually think it's neither, but both. There is and remains multiple profound disconnects in media, let's say more Dublin-based media with regards to the North. And I think that that mirrors a broader lack of understanding, fear, and reticence to engage. I think that oftentimes, like anything that happens in the North is distilled through the lens of conflict or conflict resolution. And so I think that like within the media, there just remain these archetypes that everything is about conflict or attempts to clean up the mess of a period of extreme conflict into something else. So like messy administration, and then everything being framed in green or orange. And I think that's a reflection of how an awful lot of people in the South comprehend or fail to comprehend the North. There's a massive disengagement, and I also think it's a reflection of demographics in journalism, which are largely, an awful lot of people who are from not from the North. Of viewing from afar, don't really have any nuanced understanding of society in the North, and who are not interested in engaging with the North on a human or social level, and are more interested in engaging on it as a series of cliches and inconveniences that have to constantly be, distilled about through conflict, be that political conflict, violent conflict, etc.
And I can ask you a question. How many of your friends would have considered coming north? Like of your own acquaintances, I was down south several years ago, and I had a conversation with a group of people. I think out of about 10, only about two of them had ever crossed the border. Is that
Okay.
still true?
I think that's less true. I think that the perception of Belfast in particular as like a buzzing contemporary city where there are places worth going to in terms of restaurants or festivals or whatever has changed that an awful lot. But I think that it's fair to say, like, so I'm the classic Irish Times columnist archetype of a middle class person from South County Dublin. You know, that's who I am.
Yeah.
And for better or for worse, mostly for worse. And I definitely have friends who very, very rarely go to the north. And I know people who've never been to Belfast who are from Dublin.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and would
Freya.
think nothing about going to Galway or Cork or Limerick or whatever. But I think it's
Thank
less
you.
true than it was a few years ago. But yeah, it's definitely still true. I think
Yeah.
there's a profound disengagement that the media reflects and participates in, and sometimes stokes.
Exactly. Yeah. Freya, can I ask you, I was talking to you yesterday, and you were suggesting that the Irish Times is actually, in the midst of recessions and COVID and all the rest of it, are still actually very much invested in the North. And in fact, I've appointed you quite recently as Northern correspondent. Do you see things changing in the Irish Times? Is that a real commitment to explaining the whole thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I find what Una was saying really interesting because I think I'm in sort of a different position. And obviously, I'm an Irish Times journalist and a colleague as well. But obviously, I'm from the north, and I'm based here in the north as well. And we have two people on staff now, actually, up in the north. And I suppose, I mean, if I sort of think about how I came to the Irish Times, I mean, I was originally a freelance, and for about 3 years. Well, I always say I was kind of an unusual freelance because I didn't work for anybody but the Irish Times. And I was just thinking about this after our conversation yesterday. And actually, there is nobody else actually in the world, never mind in Ireland, in the UK, in the world, who that I could have made a living with or a living from writing the kind of articles that I was writing, mainly from the Northwest. I mean, I live in Derry, you know, and I'm not just talking about, and again, what Una said was very interesting about conflict. I mean, obviously you had, you know, within that period of time, there were, you know, incidents that I suppose grabbed global headlines. I mean, I'm thinking of the Blair McKee. I'm thinking of the bomb outside the courthouse. The few months before that, there's Brexit, you know. But also reporting. I mean, the one that always sticks in my mind is I did a story about the gold mine in rural Tyrone and the controversy over it, which is really, you know, on the one hand, it's a hyper local story. It's about Greencastle in County Tyrone, which is, you know, way up in the mountains. You know, really rural, really local. It's about these people who don't want this gold mine on their doorsteps, and then about a company that's saying, well, we're going to bring jobs and we're going to bring investment, and that's a hyper local story. But actually, I would argue that it's a story that means something to people across Ireland because the issues it touches on about, you know, environmentalism, about you know, about community are in common to everybody. And you know, there's no other paper that would have interest in that story. There's no other paper that would have taken that story. And okay, it's in Tyrone, but actually it could have been in Wexford, or it could have been in Mayo, it could have been anywhere, you know. So you know, I think certainly, and again, accepting that I'm coming to this from a different point of view because I'm, you know, I'm from the north and I'm deliberately here to write about the north. But actually, what I see on the part certainly of the Irish Times is a real commitment to the north, but also commitment to actually not just telling those stories that are about conflict, that are about the past, that are about how we deal with the past. That's actually about where the north is now, because I mean, you know this, Pat, and you, Aoife, certainly know this, you know, that there's an awful lot more to this part of this island than just the trouble, you know. There's, I mean, you know, Brexit, you know, but also, you know, there's the big issues, obviously, about where we're going constitutionally, about what the future of this island is going to look like for everybody on this island, but also just, you know, the date. I mean, and again, Aoife will understand this being from Creggan, but you know, there are stories in places like Creggan that aren't just about dissidents or aren't just about you know, and it's about bringing those stories across. And actually what I find is that there's a real appetite to that and a commitment to it on the part of the Irish Times, because I mean, I couldn't be doing what I'm doing if there wasn't. And that's really, I mean, I would say this, but I think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Aoife, Aoife, I didn't realise you were from the Cregan, so my apologies. So, but here's a question: how does someone from the Cregan end up working from what used to be known in my day as the Cork Examiner, and how committed is the Examiner these days to coverage of the North?
I think I would just say about the Dublin media in general, and as they have been with Repeal the Eighth and marriage equality, they're way behind the sentiment of the people, the mood of the country at the minute. I have noticed, especially since Freya has started, that the Irish Times has taken a lot more of an interest in the Northwest and the North in general. But to be honest, the Irish Times are an outlier in terms of trying to break through to the audience to say, you know, we're very much on an island here. There are stories that don't involve conflict or bad politics or bad administration. Yeah. But even when it comes to, like, I don't want to be too hard on like named papers or broadcasters, but the Irish Times are really the only one who are making a concerted effort to get human interest stories about the North. And I don't know if that's from the people in charge or reading the public wrong, but you know, like my mommy and my granny and stuff were like one of the first families to move into Cregan, and I now work at the Examiner and I'm a political correspondent, so I spend most of my days talking about, you know, writing about Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Green Party. But when my phone goes to go on the radio, I'm only ever asked to go on when Liam McKee's been shot or John Hume dies or something happens to the Bloody Sunday families. And I just think there is this notion that they bring Northern people on to talk about Northern issues, but they don't see Northern issues as something that's part of the human interest. And I have found, especially in my generation and younger people I deal with, whether it be younger TDs to just people I meet in the pub, they have a lot more interest and a lot more knowledge about the North than different generations do. And I think there's a lot of younger people who are more willing to say, I don't really know enough about it, whereas older people tend to have their own formed opinion about it, and then they think they can tell you, you know, what the problem is with the North and why the North is different. And I find in younger people, especially in Dublin and Cork, that's not really, it's a generational thing, because it's not something I've noticed in younger people.
Yeah. Hey, here's something for all three of you, because it was something I saw yesterday. I was just reading the thing on the 7-page apology that wasn't an apology in the Sunday Independent or in regard to him. There's a guy called Edward McCann who's the deputy publisher, and I don't understand what that title is, but anyway, he said, in my view, both at the time and now, however, the paper went too far in its attacks on Hume, and some of its coverage seems to have a vindictive nastiness that undermines sometimes genuine concerns. There was an undercurrent of antipathy towards Northern nationalism of whatever hue, which would grate with me as someone who had worked on both sides of the border. Una, is that still true, that there's an antipathy towards people from the North in the Southern media?
I think what Aoife and Freya are saying is true. Like, I think that there is a generational issue or segmentation. Like, I think what Freya is saying in terms of, and it's, you know, largely due to her own work in terms of connecting very, like you call them, like hyper-local stories, but of course we know that the hyper-local is completely universal. And so, you know, that particular story, the gold mine story, you know, that could be in any part of the country. It could also be in like North Dakota or something. Like, these themes about capital and community and all that kind of stuff really connect. What Eve is saying as well about, in terms of younger generations are much more open to exploring or actually learning large tracts of social history that instead of being discussed were more opined about, that you have to have a position as opposed to have a desire to learn or know. So I think that is fading, but I do think that there is an awkwardness sometimes, and the media kind of reflects this and participates in it. There's an awkwardness about talking about the North amongst not just journalists, I suppose, but people more generally, and kind of viewing something as quite distant, even though, of course, we're sharing an island. Antipathy, I don't know. I think there's a massive shift happening, and I'm waiting for that to be reflected in, I suppose, more the upper echelons, in many ways, of the controlling forces of media. I think that's why this election, which obviously happened a few months ago, but feels, as we know, about like 10 years ago, is so interesting, because when the conversation opened up around, a party such as Sinn Féin and what that meant for younger people in Ireland, there did seem to be a generational resistance in the media to actually really digging in to what that means for the entire island. So I think that, I think Aoife rightly points out that the opinion...
And could it be argued that the media in Ireland is actually very Dublin-centric, that it sees as far as Ballsbridge or Donnybrook, and then the rest of it is some sort of barren landscape, rural Ireland, country land. Is that an unfair interpretation of sometimes the coverage?
I mean, I think that maybe is unfair, but I think that it's more about, like, what parts of media are you talking about? I do think that when we're talking about political coverage, it is far too often actually about party political coverage, and that maybe, whether that extends to Ballsbridge or whatever, I do think that in terms of political coverage, that generally means a beat around Leinster House or around the Dáil, wherever that may be sitting. And I think that's more of an issue, because I think that we end up losing large tracts and understandings of where politics actually occurs, which is often not necessarily in the Dáil chamber or whatever, or indeed in Stormont, so that when massive political change is happening or is reflected, there seems to be a lack of understanding about where that political change was born, which is generally in much more smaller movements, community activism, and broader activism more generally. So I think that blind spot in the so-called Dublin media or whatever is a big one, and it's one that is, you can't blame political reporters for covering national politics, for example. I think that we would have a broader understanding, be able to sense the political shifts if we actually paid more attention to the culture where politics is born, because that's actually what shift, like culture change shifts politics, and people make culture. So if we focused on a more holistic understanding of where politics happens and how that manifests then in the things that we're able to, like, have metrics about, like elections and representation and so on, we would have a better understanding of that. So that's something I think that plenty of jurisdictions are struggling with. And I do think that the old kind of pitted binary archetypes of media, a man with an opinion and a very political position, and a reading of a certain way of how the country works or whatever, is going. It's certainly going in the audience's eyes, and it's kind of up to media to really recognize that and catch up. That's a generational conflict within media as well, I think.
Yeah.
Freya, what's your opinion of the fact that? Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, not to interrupt. But I want to pick on something that Una had made in the point, in terms of the discussion about sort of the centre in Dublin and then the periphery. And I think you could make that same argument, as Una rightly said, probably in every jurisdiction in the world. And I'm thinking of, the charge that's often levelled against the BBC in the north, sort of from a Derry perspective, is that that they're not interested in anything sort of past Glengormley, and obviously that's not entirely true either. But there is, there's the same dynamic going on in terms of a centering, inevitably around Stormont, around Belfast, and again, back to the gold mine in Greencastle. I remember thinking, when was the last time anybody from, a newspaper, ever set foot in Greencastle? And I think it sort of it feeds into something that's quite concerning in terms of local newspapers, local and regional newspapers, and we've seen the decline of those. And I think, coronavirus has only exacerbated that. And Pat, from your own experience, Pat was the first person ever to hire me as a journalist, by the way. So, he's an awful lot to answer for. But when I think of, when I, which would have been sort of 15 years ago or so, and there were, I don't know how many, 10, 12, 14 journalists. There was the huge floor, and then there was the Donegal Democrat beside us. And there's now a handful of journalists, never mind all the titles that have closed in that same time, and that has an impact in the national media as well, because if you don't have, for example, the Mid-Ulster Mail going to the council meeting in Dungannon or wherever, and actually there's a really important story that happens there, and if you I always kind of go back to first principles of journalism. It's about holding power to account. It's about there are things going on in I sort of worry now there are things going on in local councils all over Ireland that we actually
don't know about
that need, because that goes in the Mid-Ulster Mail, and then maybe a regional paper picks it up, or the BBC in the north picks it up, and then maybe and that's how that issue gets addressed, and that's how those in power challenge. It's about that kind of holding of power to account, and I'm really concerned that there's going to be that's just not going to happen, because there aren't going to be reporters there to be there at that council meeting.
Yeah, Aoife, your paper, when anything happens in this part of the world, the Northwest, how much of an interest, if you rang up your news desk and said, look, something extra, Red's talking about the gold mine, if you rang them up and said, look, there's some, would they be in the least bit interested, or are they saying, not unless Martin McGuinness is being shot and John Hume is being shot and God knows, you know what I mean? I'm basically saying, unless it's a major incident, are they interested?
Well, actually, our news editor's from Belfast, and I'm a political correspondent now from Derry, so we're infiltrating slowly. We're cutting in, but there definitely is. It's how Northerners work. We're just going to come down and take over, but there definitely is the issue, and then Freya touched on this as well. A lot of it is to do with resources. I don't think there's any other paper outlet in the country, other than the Irish Times, that could have two staff in a Dublin office that could have two staff covering the north. They just don't have the resources. This is just, as Freya touched on already, it's a really hard time for journalism. And as I said before, the mood of the people isn't always reflected in the media, and Una knows this better than anyone with Repeal 8 and stuff like that. But I do think where there's a story, there is a story, but I just think there is this notion, and it's across all outlets, that people aren't going to care what's happening in the north unless it's something bad, or unless it's something, news stopping.
Exactly.
And I find that that's not really the case. But then the other part of it is, and this isn't me denigrating my colleagues at all, but Una touched on this already, there's a massive issue with diversity in especially political journalism. Like, there's a few women, we are there, like when we go to press conferences, there are women there. We are all white. A lot of the people, especially ones based in Dublin, went to fee-paying schools. That's something that's completely alien to me and alien to most people in the north. And I do think even in conversation, and I can probably really do this, but even in conversation, Dublin people or Dublin journalists will talk about, say, a TD or a politician who went to a certain school, and they'd say, oh, he's like that though because he went to X school. And this is where this notion of like Dublin centre comes from, because no one outside of the M50 knows what they're talking about. But there is this kind of language, and the other part of it is a lot of these TDs all went to school together in these behind schools, along with journalists and people who work in the upper echelons of journalism. So at times I think, well, it's not really their fault, because, you know, they're always running in these circles. They can't see past Donnybrook because they've never had to. So I do think more needs to be done. And, you know, even like when I started at the Examiner, a lot of people noted, they were like, oh, there's a Northerner at the Examiner, a Northerner political correspondent at the Examiner. And I just think Ireland doesn't look like it looked like 20, 30 years ago. So our journalism can't look like it looked like 20, 30 years ago, because we're missing the point all the time. And like, you know, I keep talking about these referendums, but we're behind. It's an old kind of tradition, and we need to get out in front of it. And I do think there's great work being done in different outlets, but I think, you know, this Dublin-centric nature of it is reflected in all things, whether that's hiring, whether that's people that they know, and people's mindset are set a certain way. For instance, now this isn't about the North, but for instance, when Saoirse McHugh left the Green Party a couple of weeks ago, there was genuine meltdown from people in the media. Like, people could not believe that she just said, you know, I said I was going to leave if they did this, so now I'm going to leave. I don't really think electoral politics works for most people. Yeah. And there was like nearly tears, like was a meltdown on Twitter from like loads of people on, you know, who work in the media, like, how could she possibly think this? And it's like, maybe your point of view isn't the only point of view. And I do think when it comes to the North, younger people are falling away from traditional journalism because they're thinking, well, if I disagree with them on, I don't know, taxes and welfare, maybe I'm not going to listen to what they have to say about the North as well. So, you know what I mean? People are falling away from that. If you don't see yourself reflected in something, you're not going to pay much attention to it. And I feel like the media in Dublin definitely has to start making changes, and there are changes being made, but it's just not at the same rate, because if you talk to any constitutional lawyer or anyone who has an interest in it, there's a border poll coming, whether it's the next 2 years, whether it's the next 10 years.
You've just shut up the next part. Thanks very much for that, by the way. I just broadened, exactly, you've just led me on where I was trying to broaden that out. Right, here's a few facts. 4 out of the 6 counties are now nationalist majorities. And Belfast, the unions are, it's a nationalist city now by and large. In the Assembly, unionists are in the minority. And in the last elections, for the first time ever, unionists lost control. And the demographics suggests that by 2021, the unionists will actually be a minority in the North. And yet, no one seems to understand. Micheál Martin is leader of Fianna Fáil, and he seems to run away from any discussion about a border vote or anything to do with in the North. Do you seriously think that the South is ready to address a major issue that's coming down the track?
Me?
Yeah, you. Please.
Again, the mood of the people is way ahead of Leinster House and way ahead of the media. I think it's become common knowledge now when people talk about, people expect a border poll. It might be this year, it might be next year, it could be in the next 10 years, but people know it's coming down the line. Brexit has completely changed what people think about United Ireland and these constitutional issues in the EU. And with COVID and the COVID response, it's only made people closer to the EU, especially during Brexit negotiations when Ireland was backed almost totally by the EU member states. It's made Irish people more determined to be part of the EU, and they see Brexit as such a catastrophic mistake. So I think if you speak to most like a man in the street, they're going to say, yeah, I think in my lifetime I'll probably see a border poll. I think on the political side of it, Micheál Martin only has 2.5 years as the Taoiseach. He has spent his life trying to become the Taoiseach, and I just don't think he wants to do anything that's going to cause such waves or such kind of like something he'll be remembered for if it doesn't go his way. He's very pragmatic, and I think this is me completely guessing, but the way I think he looks at it is like, if not everyone's ready, I'm not going to do this, because if it backfires, it'll backfire spectacularly. And they also have this fear, especially in Dublin, and maybe rightly so to an extent, that, you know, there are a lot of unionists, not just in the north, but there are a lot of unionists in the north. It's their country too. We need to look after these people. We need to make sure that, you know, everybody's on board when we do this. And there is a lot of like placating Stormont. You often find, you know, soft talk, and like you will very, very rarely ever hear a politician from the south of Ireland criticising anything the DUP or the UUP or anything say. You know, they might criticise Sinn Féin and to a lesser extent maybe the SNP. You very, very rarely hear them, whether it's, you know, if they have an opposition to gay marriage or abortion or anything like that. You will never hear a Dublin politician or a TV criticising unionists. And I think that feeds into this wider kind of thought of like, don't want to make waves, don't want it to be us that's doing it. But there is a border poll coming. I just don't, and I think it's going to be, someone explained it to me actually, like when they reunited Germany, that came way before they were prepared for it, and they had nothing done. Like they weren't prepared for it at the time. And I think that's what's going to happen to Ireland. People are going to be so afraid to be making preparations. Preparations aren't going to be done. And then if it does happen, we'll be left with nothing organised.
Right. Una, what's your view on the same of that? Thank you, Phil. What's your view on the whole issue of this? Is the Southern media preparing the people for possibly what's coming down the track, or are they in denial?
I think probably in denial. I mean, I think unfortunately there's a, how do I explain this? I think going back to the election coverage, like, so anything around the concept of United Ireland is viewed as the domain of Sinn Féin. And Sinn Féin is covered in a particular way a lot of the time. What
do you mean by that? What do you mean by in a particular way? What do you mean?
Well, I think that the vast majority, the majority of coverage of Sinn Féin is hypercritical, and is rooted in a reflex that is, I suppose, kind of is 20th century journalism, really, that is rooted in a reflex, as we saw during some of the election coverage this year, that was just persistently talking about the IRA. Now, of course, that coverage was really, really exposed in terms of how it intersected with what people actually accept, believe, and feel. So, constantly reiterating the facts of Sinn Féin's history is seen, I think, amongst a lot of journalists as something that will therefore completely deter anybody from voting for Sinn Féin and undercuts all of their policies and makes them incompatible with being in power.
Yeah.
Of course, that is completely untrue. That is not how people perceive, a lot of people who perceive Sinn Féin. The facts of their history, the facts of the IRA do not deter people from voting for Sinn Féin in the South, very obviously. And no matter how many times a party, for example, Fine Gael in particular, criticises Sinn Féin, and to the point that it's almost a muscle memory reflex, not even strategic, that completely backfires. and we know that the anything around conversations about the IRA in relation to Sinn Féin does not deter voters. I don't understand strategically or tactically why they're opposing political parties, in particular Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, keep trying to talk about that, because it very obviously doesn't work. I mean, Gerry Adams was arrested in 2014 in the middle of an election campaign and got elected. You know, so criticising Sinn Féin on that basis doesn't work. So strategically, it's a bunk. Now, more so then about how people actually feel, and the media's lack of ability to square that circle is rooted in a bias that is a kind of a 20th century version of events, and holding on to what the controversies, for want of a better word, of a political party are, and therefore attaching all of the ideologies that flow from that to something that is incompatible with being in power. We know that Sinn Féin is, you know, the most popular party in the state. We know that Mary Lou McDonald, up until recently, was the most popular leader or political leader. We know that that this is not just a generational thing, although it is profoundly generational in some ways, in that Sinn Féin is obviously the most popular party amongst younger people, but also amongst middle-aged people too. So all of these things, it does feel like a lot of the time the media is having a conversation that belongs in a different time. Again, all of these shifts are cultural. The patriotism, for want of a better word, nationalism, whatever you want to call it, that has emerged over the past 20 years is to do with so many things that are very complex amongst young people in the South. For example, you can talk about how an awful lot of people were politicized through activism. You can talk about how people do not fall along tribal lines in terms of political parties, how the idea of civil war politics, or like your family being Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, belongs in the 20th century. This is not a concern to people who are 20 or 21, 22. In fact, it's totally ridiculous. You can talk about how the centenary of 2016 accidentally birthed a discourse that was about a very benign neo-patriotism that, although led by a Fine Gael government and all of their, you know, comms units and all that kind of stuff, actually fed into a new type of patriotism that Sinn Féin has ended up capitalising on, as opposed to going out and searching for it. So you can talk about all of those things, but I think the recent election coverage is such a great example, because from RTE to obviously the Independent to various other quarters, the discombobulation that you could almost see in real time flow out from a lot of opinion writing or political coverage, that it seemed to be that a lot of journalists, particularly opinion journalists, could not simply get their head around the fact that their version of Ireland was now over here, was an existential moment for journalism, I think, here.
Freya, can I go to you on this one? On the last election, 525,000 people, as far as I recall, voted for Sinn Féin. The media almost went into apoplexy about this whole thing, and
we didn't. Well, I didn't. Because I reported on
it. Then when I know the point I made earlier about all the demographics in the north, there's a convergence coming no matter what way you come at it, and yet it's almost the media are in denial about what is actually going to happen. So, Freya, what is your opinion on is the Irish Times leading public opinion, or is it way behind it?
I don't know. Obviously, we're at the forefront of public opinion. You know, I suppose, you know, again, I'm always mindful that I come to this sort of from a different, you know, perspective, because I'm not Dublin based. I'm not in that, and Aoife and Anna would have a better handle on that than I would, you know. And I mean, you know, the point that you make about that election, you know, yeah, I mean that, you know, that was a really important moment, and that's a really significant moment in terms of sort of, you know, the shifting of the dynamics of this discussion, this debate, and where we are. And I think we've seen, you know, we've seen so many of those moments in recent times, and on all of which are tilting, you know, slowly or quickly towards, you know, towards the border poll, towards the United Ireland question, towards shared Ireland, you know, whatever the terminology you want to put on that. And I think, and far be it for me to disagree with Aoife, who has a better handle on this than me, and that she's down there in the middle of it. But I mean, I think the shared island unit that's been set up in the Taoiseach's office, I actually think that is significant, and you can debate, you know, what might or might not come out of it, and what it represents, whatever. But it's still, you know, it's still an Irish government officially taking cognizance and recognising the conversations that are going on about the constitutional future of the island. So I think it's significant in those terms, and I think, you know, in terms of where we are, and again, sort of to come back to the Irish Times view on it, you know, we feel very strongly that actually that you know, this is the key debate, this is the key moment. You know, everything is up for grabs. You know, we are now talking about the constitutional arrangements on this island, you know, in a way they haven't been talked about in a long time. You know, the conversations are, I mean, you know, this is certainly going on within Northern nationalism, and not just political nationalism, but civic nationalism. It is also going on.
Yeah.
Going on amongst unionism as well, whether they say it is or not, you know. So, you know, there is a growing recognition, I think, that these are the questions. And I know, you know, it's something that I've spent an awful lot of time writing about and trying to get under the skin of, and also to, you know, explain it in all its complexity to our readers, most of whom are in the south, or who you know, certainly who, you know, there are far more readers in the south than there would be in the north. And I suppose, again, it's about exploring all those complexities. It's not just orange and green, it's not just black and white, it's not just a simple either or, you know, it's hugely complex and nuanced. And I think actually what journalism and what the media needs to be doing at the moment is exploring that and unpicking it. Challenging, certainly, absolutely, that's really key, but also, you know, what does all this mean? What, you know, what might this look like? You know, how might this happen? I mean, there are all these really big questions. And the other thing I would say is, just to come back, I think it was Aoife made the point about resources. You know, if people in the north want more coverage of the north in southern papers and want a greater understanding, you know, go out and buy papers. You know, support responsible, ethical, informed journalism. And again, you know, this is a question that's much wider than the north or south. But, you know, if we don't do that, then there's going to be nobody there asking those questions. And I really wouldn't want to be making decisions on, you know, what United Ireland might look like off the basis of what a load of random people on Twitter say, you know. So.
Yeah. Right, Freya, I'm going to have to wrap this up, Charlie, but here, let me stay with you on this one. One of the sort of background there, and the background noise, is about the 7-page coverage on Sunday about the treatment of humans, southern media. That's one of the things. But, you know, the Irish Times didn't exactly cover its glory in regard, from the point of view of many Northerners, in regard to Ken Myers going for years. The Sunday Times had Owen Harris, and then he later found the Sunday Independent. Like, for instance, your old friend Joe Duffy, when Martin McGuinness died, he had a basically, I'll do the subjective term. He basically did a hatchet job. He had 3 or 4 people on who had an agenda against Martin McGuinness, and made no effort to balance it by getting on people who were going, this was only lifeline pro. With that sort of history, do you think that the media has sort of basically set up a sort of a narrative that the people in the north are troublemakers, so let's build a wall around them and a plague in both their houses? Is that, you know, is that where we're at now? And is that what we are going to have to overcome if we're going to talk seriously about where we go for and the future of this island? And then, by the way, I'm going to ask all three of you the same question. After we wrap it up.
Yeah, I'd be honest, I didn't hear any of the Liveline coverage, and Joel killed me for saying it because I was too busy reporting. I was too busy running around Derry, sort of interviewing people. But yeah, you know, yeah, take your point, and I mean, certainly some of the language. I mean, some of the language that was used in Sunday Independent about Hume. I think is indefensible. You know, I mean, some sort of calling him a bomber and the implication he had blood in his hands. I mean, all this. I do think that was over the top, and I think that, you know, the Sunday Independent sort of belatedly.
But did that not set the tone, Freya?
I mean, and I'm not saying this is a cop out, but I can't really comment with any authority on what happened back in '93 because I was about 11, I think. Do you know what I mean?
You're going to say you're too young.
I just well no, but what I'm going to say, because I think that's, you know, I always think that's a very poor defense. What I'm going to follow that up with is I simply don't have the authority and the knowledge to compare specifically the coverage from 1993. But what I did come across when I was doing the research for Children in the Troubles with Joe, and I spent an awful lot of time looking at newspapers north and south, and again, I know this is going to come across like I'm defending the Irish Times all the time, and that's not, you know, that's not what I'm here to do, and I fully accept, you know, there are many things that we could be doing better, but one of the things that I did notice was that there was a real effort on the part of the Irish Times who had people in Belfast and in Derry right through the Troubles, but to do again those stories that I think get under the skin of things. And what there was a series that stood out, and it was about joyriding in the 80s in West Belfast. There were a lot of children, teenagers who were killed, sort of, you know, cars that, you know, joyriding cars that had gone through army checkpoints, they were shot and things like this, and there was a lot of coverage of this, and actually efforts to go and talk to the young people and talk to people in the community, and the reason that stuck in my mind is because it was different again to that accepted narrative of, oh, they're all just mad up there and they're just sort of running around killing each other, and I think I mean you know, you're absolutely right, there's a sense, you know, there's a sense if we're outside the north that to an extent, you know, they're all just mad up there, you know, and I'm sure that was said in London as much as it was in Dublin. I mean, we've all heard the thing, you know, it's just build a great big fence around it and let it float off into the sea, you know. But I do think that certainly my experience with the Irish Times and going back, would be different. And I would take you back to something, if we're sort of talking in the past. I mean, in 1974, when the Irish Times Trust was established, you know, one of their guiding principles was that they were concerned with serious issues for the benefit of the community throughout the whole of Ireland. You know, there's no distinction made there, and certainly that's what I would try and do. And I've said again, you know, I'm not here to say the Irish Times is wonderful and everything that it.
Do you think the Irish Times is doing it now?
But sorry.
Do you think the Irish Times is doing it now?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, and I think I'm proof of that in a sense, and myself, my colleague Jerry, I think we are proof of that, because there's nobody else, with the exception of RTE, from the Summit, who would have 2 people on staff up in the north, and that's a demonstration of our commitment. And I think, you know, I think most people who've, you know, followed our coverage from the north would agree with that. Hope they would. Anyway.
Yeah. Aoife, do you think Northerners are fighting an uphill battle when it comes to perceptions and media perceptions and even public perceptions in the Republic?
I can just say from my own personal experience, and I've actually talked about this with Mick O'Toole. He's the deputy editor for the Irish Daily Star, like a really prominent crime correspondent. He's from West Belfast. And we have both said that the only anti-Northern sentiment that I've ever had said to my face has been from other journalists or people in Dublin. It's often said as like, you'll know it yourself. Like, they say it like a joke, but there's an incredibly insulting kind of thing behind it. And, you know, there's like minor things that, like taking the piss out of your accent or something, which I don't mind at all. But this notion of like, you're all mad, I hear that quite a lot. when I first started at Press Association, me and Kate McCurry, she's from Dungannon, they sent both of us down to Dublin, and we were using a hot desk room in Leinster House. There's a map of Ireland on the wall, but it's got the north is just all in pale white. The rest of it, the counties are all coloured. And we had been there 2 days, and someone had written on the north, Madland, and drew a big border around it in the office where we were sitting. Now, this person probably thought it was a joke, but it was another journalist that did it, and they thought this was a joke. It's still there in the hot desk in Leinster House if you ever want to go and look at it. But we didn't tell anybody, and we just left it. And but that was kind of the general mood that we got, was like, there isn't very many Northerners. I believe Stephen Collins from the Times Ireland, there's only maybe one other, between me and Kate, one other Northern political correspondent. So you are kind of few and far between. And I actually haven't received that from people in pubs or like friends of friends. It tends to be people who think that they know the North. So they'll say, these kind of like jokes with a jag kind of things.
Yeah.
And when it comes to an uphill battle, the uphill battle is going to be with the media. It's not the public in general.
Yeah.
It's the media, because the media is feeding this narrative. And just as another way, like on the flip side of it, just to go back to the election, from the flip side of it, from people in my community, and Freya can probably attest to this as well, people in the north who watched the coverage of the election in the south found it incredibly insulting. The way that, not that they were Sinn Féin voters and they were insulted on behalf of Sinn Féin, but this sudden and great, very big interest in Northern Ireland's history only came to the fore in the 4 weeks before the election. And it was very transparent to people who live north of the border that this is only because of the election.
Yeah.
And that is me. I'm not at all. I think Breach Quinn had more than enough right to come down to Dublin, and for her, it wasn't about the election. She's been campaigning for years, as she should. But there was a sudden and very clear interest because Sinn Féin were topping the polls, and people north of the border had all said to me, "Oh, do they care about the north now?" And they didn't care about the north. It was to do with the election. It was to do with Sinn Féin and the polls. And I think that kind of attitude, as Una said, is so last generation. And the more people fall away from journalism, these are going to be the reasons why.
I think not only was it, sorry,
Go
just
ahead,
like to make it extra insulting, not only was it an interest in history, let's say, of the North or whatever, specific incidents to do with the election, it was only an interest if those incidents could be used as a stick with which to beat Sinn Féin, which is even more insulting in terms of, pardon the pun, to weaponize those incidents to score political points. So yeah, I can't imagine how incredibly irritating and insulting that must have been for people in the North, because I mean, so much of the coverage was just hysterical anyway. And I also, from my own perspective, I think it's incredibly interesting as somebody, who's not from the North, that when one writes about Sinn Féin without being hypercritical from the outset, even when you're just providing an analysis, if it's not hypercritical, you are automatically attacked for having a bias, a pro-Sinn Féin bias. Yet when vast swathes of the media are very overtly biased, I'm speaking mostly in terms of like opinion stuff or commentary, that's just how you talk about this particular political entity. So that's a problem, media constantly talks about impartiality and all that kind of stuff, and these things don't really exist. Let's face it, everybody's coming from somewhere, even if it's completely unconscious or subconscious. But I think there was some really great reporting and coverage during the election, and there was some absolutely terrible not reporting but coverage an opinion, and that just amplified that disconnect and made people, like really regular sound thinking people, become anti-mainstream media as a result, as if they themselves were like, I know friends of mine who found themselves going, oh my God, I'm talking like one of these people who's like the MSM, you know, when they're just a normal person and they're reading the Times or the Indo or something, and getting extremely exercised because of how the bias was so dominant. So I think it's more about, like, you know, moving forward. You know, I don't necessarily really hang out with a lot of journalists and stuff like that. I'm freelance technically, and I work from home and I'm not in the office. I think it's more about, like, if the media reflects stuff and if the politicians kind of follow and show up later, for me, it's more about how do we as people, as ordinary people, find the spaces and the forums to have dialogue that is actually about the future, that is actually about how we can share this island, not just in practical terms, but in emotional terms. And how do we not claim space, but share space? You know, those are the kind of more holistic, more empathic conversations that I'm interested in. And I think that those conversations and forums will begin to take hold, because I don't think people have the same entrenched points of view. I actually think people are optimistic and ambitious about what we can do as an island, and whether that freaks, you know, whether certain political parties, that freaks them out because they think that certain other political parties will be able to claim that and hold that, or whether people have to, you know, feel that there's still loads of unresolved stuff, or whether they're ignorant of things. That's their issue. I'm interested in how can a new generation build alliances that we haven't even imagined yet. That's what I think the future holds.
On that very upbeat note, and by God, that's the first time I think any discussion in the North's ever ended on an upbeat note. Una Mullally, broadcaster and the Irish Times columnist, thanks very much. Aoife Grace Moore from the Irish Examiner, thanks very much. And my old colleague, Freya McClemens, Irish Times correspondent, thanks very much. On behalf of the Yard Freya, thanks very much for your contribution. Really, really interesting, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mel.